This is A-level psychology. This is social influence. And in this video, we're looking at explanations for obedience, which is on pages 19 to 20 of your booklet. And we're looking at what's called social psychological explanations. There are two of them: agentic state and legitimacy of authority. Now, before we start, just a little bit of context. When Milgram did his study, he was looking at the power of the situation in changing our obedience level, and found that actually the situation had a really big impact. That's as opposed to it being like a personality factor, or what we call a dispositional factor. What we're looking at today is these aren't situational factors. These are called social psychological factors. All that means is it's the way we perceive the social dynamics involved. So as we go through these, that should make a bit more sense to you. So about our perception of what's happening in terms of social dynamics. So let's have a look at them then. Legitimate authority. Legitimate is just another way of saying valid, really. And this explanation says that we obey people because we assume that if they have authority, it's because they've earned it. It's important that, respect for authority is good in a society. It means that we don't have riots all the time. It means we have law and order. It's only when you have an authority figure who is morally corrupt or bad in some way that it can end up being a negative thing. But we're trained to obey people in authority because for most of the time we can assume that it's valid for them to have that authority. They've earned their way up to it. You expect that the chief of police, for example, has spent many years as a policeman and earned the respect of their colleagues and finally been appointed to that role. And as we said before, the legitimacy of authority or respect for authority is increased by someone wearing a uniform. Because that uniform acts as a symbol of their authority. So that's legitimate authority. Let's look at the agentic shift. This is the explanation that's often linked to the Nazis. If you remember Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, saying at his trial, "I was just following orders." This is the explanation we'd use for his behaviour. So the way this explanation goes is that most of the time, the way we behave is we are independent or otherwise known as autonomous individuals. That's just another word for independent. That basically means we behave voluntarily, we choose our own actions, and we accept that we're responsible for our own actions and that there will be consequences for them. Now, when someone asks you to do something, what can happen is we undergo what's called an agentic shift. And basically, instead of having our own responsibility for our own actions, we end up seeing ourselves as an agent of that person. So instead of thinking, "Oh, I'm responsible for this thing I'm doing," we then think, "Oh, they're responsible for this thing that I'm doing." And that's called being on the agentic level. We don't view ourselves, remember, social psychological factors, the way we perceive the social dynamics. Our perception is that we're not responsible for our actions in that state. And that's not, we're still carrying out our actions. Nothing else has really changed, but that's our perception of the situation that's changed. So what makes us undergo it? Partly that we're trained to obey from a really early age. Children are trained to be obedient and do what they're told. And mostly that's fine because the vast majority of things that we're asked to do are reasonable and appropriate. There are things called binding factors that will keep us in an agentic state once they're there. So stuff like denying any damage that they've done. So for example, if you think about Milgram's participants, once the learner's gone quiet, quite easy for them to sort of metaphorically stick their fingers in their ears and go la 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 as they complete the rest of the experiment, just flicking the switches. There's silence from the other room. They just carry on and go up to the end. They can almost like shut their eyes to what they're doing. The other things that can keep them in the agentic state, obeying the orders, things like shifting responsibility to the victim. So that might happen, for example, let's say a police officer is asked to do something immoral, like beat up someone that's been arrested for something. They might say to themselves, to justify doing it, they might say, oh, well, they shouldn't have done that thing that got them arrested in the first place, so it's okay. Or equally, they can shift responsibility to the person giving the order. Well, I don't really agree with what I'm being asked to do here, but it's not my fault. It's their fault. They've asked me to do it, so it's their responsibility. So those sorts of things, and again, it's all about how we're viewing it psychologically, our perception of what's happening. Those are factors that will keep us in that state, keep us following orders. So before we carry on, you might like to pause the video and think about these two questions. What signs are there in Milgram's experiment of the authority being legitimate? There's 2 signs to look out for. And the second question, are there any signs that participants were operating on the agentic level? So pause the video now and think about those. Right, so in terms of answers for that, first of all, the 2 signs of legitimate authority in Milgram were the fact that the experiment is in a white coat, which is a symbol of their authority, and also the university setting gives legitimacy to the experiment. The agentic shift signs, if you watch that video of the participant in Milgram's original study saying stuff like, it's on you, and the experimenter saying, I take full responsibility for what happens here, those are quite clear signs of the agentic shift happening. Equally, when the experimenter is switched out with a member of the public, the fact that obedience levels reduce is the fact kind of links to the agentic shift, because it shows that the participant feels that they have responsibility. Because you've taken away that authority figure, it's harder for that person to say, oh, he told me to do it, it's his fault. Because the person isn't there, they feel they have more responsibility for what's happening. So that supports the idea of agentic shift and kind of shifting of responsibility. The last factor in Milgram where we see this is the fact that when the learner's in the same room, again, obedience rates drop because they feel more responsible for what they're doing. Equally, they're less able to sort of close their eyes to what they're doing, which removes that binding factor. So that's where you see all of those factors within Milgram. Now, we want to ask this question briefly when we're looking at evaluating these factors. Do we think these sorts of things can really explain situations like the Holocaust? Can we really explain the horrific atrocities such as the Holocaust by saying, oh, it's because of social perceptions of the perceptions, the social dynamics involved? So let's have some you can think about that yourself and probably think of a number of pros and cons towards it. Let's just look at some other sorts of pros and cons in this area. So the first thing to say is that actually the idea of agentic state is supported by when Milgram interviewed his participants, and equally when you look at what they're saying during the experimenter, during the experiment, when they're questioning the experimenter, they're only carrying on when they're happy that it's not their fault. That suggests that this is a factor that's at play here. It's also supported by Milgram's variations on proximity, as we've already discussed. And it's supported by Blass and Schmidt, who actually took this scenario, or a similar one, and asked students to say whose responsibility is it that the learner has been harmed? Is it the fault of the teacher, the participant, or is it the fault of the experimenter? And the vast majority of students said it's the experimenter's fault. So that supports the idea of agentic state, because it's showing that lots of people's perception that the responsibility is with the experimenter in that case, that the participant is only acting as an agent. Right, what do we have that supports the idea of legitimacy of authority? We've got Milgram's variation into location, where you've got the CD offices. It's supported by the variation on uniform, where you replace the experimenter with a member of the public who's not wearing uniform, and obedience instantly drops right down. It's supported by Bickman's research into uniform, which you're aware of from the last lesson, where obedience drops when the person giving instructions is not in uniform. So there you have it. And I'll leave you with that question to discuss whether you think that these explanations could really explain the Holocaust.